tell you, I'm here under false pretenses. The email announcing this that I was going to talk about sailing around the world. It's not something I've actually done. I just spent a lot of time sailing around and all on the world here. So
Close enough.
I will attempt to speak up. The impetus for this was an email I got from Charlie. So it's organized around some questions that he asked. There were so many things to talk about that I couldn't really think about how to organize it. It could just be a whole bunch of sea stories, and I might slip some in, but this is kind of where it started from. The very first thing I would say is if you want to get on a boat and sail around the world or just around the ocean for a while or whatever, make sure you have a willing partner. I have met more people whose marriages are either coming apart or they're selling their boat in some exotic place because they decided to pack up and sail, and only one of them really wanted to do that. There was a couple here in Portland that we got to know fairly well. They had a 38-foot Cayenne, one of those double-ended, go anywhere ocean-proofing kind of boats. And it turned out that he really wanted to go sailing, and he was afraid to get out of sight of land. It was not a match made in heaven. And when my wife and I first started talking about doing this, 2010, we sold our house and took off and went sailing for 5 years. But in 2006, when we decided we were going to do it, I was shopping for a boat. We met some people in Nia Bay who were an Australian couple that had been circumnavigating, and they were heading home. And they were looking for proof. I had work commitments. There was no way I could do it. My wife had a job where she always asked them, do you want me to come back? I'm going. Do you want me to come back when I'm done? And so she went. She sailed with them from San Diego to La Paz as a shakedown. And they decided they liked her well enough, so she sailed with them again from La Paz to the Marquesas. So when we decided to go sailing, she already knew that she could do it and that she enjoyed doing it. That's probably the most important thing that you could possibly do. Our sailing was not long-distance ocean crossing sailing, but we also weren't part of the floating Winnebago. There's a large selection of people who do the ha-ha-ha-ha. They get down to the Mexican Riviera, and they never leave. It's very much like they typically leave the boat, come home for the summer, go back south, spend the winter, and it's a fine thing to do, but it's very much like owning a motorhome going to Arizona every day. We sailed 25,000 miles in 5 years, which is the equivalent of sailing around the world, but we backtracked a lot and then went a lot of different places, and so wound up sailing down the west coast, through the Panama Canal, about 3 or 4 laps of the Caribbean, back through the canal, several laps up and down the coast of Mexico, and then back to Portland. Preparing for a voyage was the first item, and I broke that down into 2 things. One is preparing long-term, which is 2006 we bought a boat. It doesn't matter whether you buy a brand new boat or a really old boat. Unless somebody has already done all the work, it's not ready to go through. You're going to need much bigger batteries than anybody supplies on a production boat. You're going to need some solar panels to keep them charged up. You're going to need to figure out what kind of spare parts you need, carry an inventory. My idea for spare parts, because I've read books that you carry everything, an extra one of everything on the boat. It's impractical. If you wait till you have enough money to buy all that stuff, you're never going anywhere. What I chose was, gee, if I could fix that at sea, and it would get me to where I'm going, it might be worth having spare. If I can't fix it at sea, I'll just find some way to get where I'm going and get the spare after I get there. So, you don't have to have absolutely everything. In terms of choosing a boat, if you read all the old-timers books, they'll tell you want a full keel boat, weighs about 20,000 pounds for a 30-footer. And there's 2 of those that are on the market today. One of them, well, not on the market anymore, but very popular, is the West Sail. 32, 42, and 43, which cruisers affectionately refer to as a wet sail. They are extremely heavy and extremely slow. There was one of them with us on the Ha-Ha. Got on the radio after we've been sailing for about maybe a half an hour or something like that, and they said, "We've just cleared the harbor mouth. We passed a turtle." So I chose a boat that was in the middle. It had kind of a thin keel, but a skeg-hung rudder, because a lot of people were saying, "Gosh, that's the way to go." If I were choosing again today, I wouldn't insist on a skeg-hung rudder. I've seen Beneteaus, the seagoing Beneteaus, not the charter specials, sailing around the world. They do just fine. I think that a modern boat will get you out of places where you'd rather not be, rather than surviving in a boat that can't sink. So, if I were choosing another boat today, I would not insist on it being a slow boat. On the other hand, we sailed with some people who were in a J40. J-boats are essentially club racers. You have some sort of liveaboard accommodations, but they're mostly race boats. And we went provisioning with them one time, took a taxi in town. We had about a whole trunk full of groceries, and they had 2 bags. And my wife said, "Why so few groceries?" And she said, "That's all I'm allowed. No build space, no storage space. Not an ideal boat for cruising." So, you need to pick the kind of a boat that is ideal for you, and then you need to make a bunch of updates to be ready to go. And then I think the question Charlie was actually asking was, in preparing for a voyage, how do you make that plan for the next trip? To me, we always had the boat ready to go. Essentially, if I left the dock, everything was tied down, everything went along. It didn't matter whether we were going across the harbor or across the planet. Have more food on board if you're going across the planet, obviously. So, planning, the first step is, and there's a book in here, I couldn't find it when I went to ask Bruce. It's in our library. It's called Cruising Routes of the World Cruising Routes, written by a guy named Jimmy Cornell. And in addition to interviewing about 10,000 sailing cruisers, he did a whole lot of research on global weather patterns and conditions, and picked routes from virtually anywhere to anywhere else. It's a really great place to start, because you want to make sure that you're avoiding hurricanes, tropical storms, whatever weather occurs where you're planning on going, you want to avoid it. There's a series going around right now on Small Boats Monthly, a couple sailing a smallish wooden boat in southeast Alaska. And the most recent edition is sailing up Panama Canal. I can remember being airborne in the 95-foot Coast Guard patrol boat, making about 5 knots, because we couldn't go any faster. The prop wouldn't stay wet in Panama Canal. So you want to be going there at a different time. So after you pick, about the right kind of weather window, then you start actually watching weather. And technology is great. You can now download what's called a grid file, GRID. It stands for gridded binary file, and it's a worldwide standard format. If you've used Sailboat or any of those programs that purport to give you a weather forecast, they're not forecasting weather. What they're doing is they're downloading those. This is a model that's run every 6 hours, 24/7, around the clock, around the world. And it's real built in this monstrous data file. You can choose a piece of it to the area you're going, with granularity of every 1 degree or every half degree of latitude, longitude, whatever suits your needs. The point is, it's a tiny little file. So when we were cruising, we had a satellite phone. I didn't want to go. You have 2 options. You have a single sideband radio or satellite phone for offshore communication. Single sideband radio is pretty complex. It's free to operate, but it's pretty expensive and complex installation. The sat phone costs $1 a minute. but it works like a modem. If you remember your 9600 modem, most of you are old enough to remember that, you could kind of read it as it came in. That's what you get with a sat phone. But these grid files are so compact that when we were making longer passages, every 2 days I could download a weather picture for a 10-day window in the area where we're operating. So having done all that, let's see. Oh yeah, one other thing. Social media, although there are terrible trolls out there, even on the cruising boards, just like everywhere else, you can find out a lot of current information on various bulletin boards. The cruising, I can't remember the name of it. Do you remember, Chuck? That cruising association that has people everywhere. They have harbor masters everywhere.
The Cruising Club of America?
That's one. Thank you. Yeah.
CCA.
It's a great source, and they do try to manage the trolls a little bit and keep it. Mostly, they try to keep things on topic, so we don't turn into a political wrestling match. But a great place to go. Take what you get there with a grain of salt. A lot of the things that we learned going to Mexico were 10 years out of date before we got there. So you don't want to trust it quite as much. The weather sources like Jimmy Cornell, the weather doesn't change that much. Climate change is gradually changing things a bit, but in general, worldwide weather patterns don't change that much. What's going on locally changes a lot, and you're going to want the most recent information you can get. Charlie's next probation was provisioning. So in general, we tried to eat what we would eat at home. Before we left, I spent a lot of money building a refrigerator with ultra-high efficiency insulation so that we could keep the freezer operating with 12-volt refrigeration. Had I known as much as I know now about solar panels, we never would have needed to run the engine at all. But at the time, I didn't know enough about it. I didn't buy enough solar panels, and I tried to get by with a wind generator, which is, as far as I'm concerned, a useless piece of equipment on a sailboat. But so provisioning for a longer trip, what we would do is we would go to the grocery store, buy all the same kind of groceries you would normally use, fill the fridge. We had a food saver vacuum sealer, and we would cook stews and soups and various things that could be packaged up in one-meal packages, so that regardless of how nasty it got, if you can, we had a belt and some books, and the galley is this big. You belt yourself in there. The stove's right in front of you. It's on gimbals. You can cook in any weather. And all you got to do is cut open the bag, put it in there, apply some heat, and put it in a bowl. Get some high-sided bowls, because standard soup won't really
Don't fill them up. Yeah.
when you're coming out of the water every once in a while, a standard soup bowl is useless. But I've seen so many people. There's this event that takes place every year. They used to call it the Oregon Offshore, and I can't remember the new name for it, but it's a race from the mouth of the Columbia. I think they're back to going to Victoria. They used to go to Victoria, and then during the pandemic, they switched it to Port Angeles. At any rate, I've known a lot of sailors. It's a big deal for Portland sailors because they're not used to going offshore. And they run down to the grocery store and they get about 4 bags full of top ramen and Snickers bars and potato chips. And you see people it's about a 2-day race typically, and in 2 days these people are just completely spent. They're just used up. Part of it is because they're racing and they're not sleeping very well. Part of it is because they're not eating very well. And a hot meal at least once a day is really, really an important thing. So we would provision for that. Typical food would be something like granola, no toaster because, well, you need a plug-in for that. So we would have something like granola and almond milk or whatever. We could get, especially in Latin America, we could get almost all of our food in Tetra Paks, which are those
square boxes. Um, they're easy to stow, they're waterproof. You can buy shelf-stable milk, and all kinds of things that you can just put in the bilge, protect them from getting squashed, and they'll last practically forever. So, granola and cereal of some kind, whatever, for breakfast, a sandwich for lunch, and we always had a hot dinner. Typically, I would cook, or my wife would cook dinner. We'd eat dinner together, change the watch, and I would wash the dishes and go to bed. One thing to keep in mind about if you're cruising 2 people on a sailboat, you're really single-handed. I didn't cover this in the boat prep, but when you're prepping your boat for this kind of sailing, just imagine you're going to be single-handed. Because essentially single-handers are people who just don't keep watch half the time. When you're double-handing, you always have somebody on watch. But you can't anchor, you can't stop. There's no time out there. So single-handers are simply taking the chance that they have various strategies like waking up every half hour and looking around, or setting an alarm with a radar. All very dangerous, but I think that's a matter of what your risk tolerance is. Bill?
So Mitch, what watch standing hours did you keep?
Yeah, I got that later here, but that was one of the things that Charlie asked about. So we experimented quite a bit. The typical watches are just 4 hours. That's standard military service. I think it's merchant marine too, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So just 4, 4, 4, 4, 4. It doesn't work very well with just 2 people because you never get quite enough sleep. So we came up with a strategy of 3, 4, 5. So 7 to midnight. That was my wife's watch. I'm starting at dinner time because that's the easiest way to. This is how we came up with it. 7 to midnight. I would wash the dishes, make coffee, fill the thermos, go to bed. I'm up at midnight and up until 5. And it was really important for those 2 watches. Our rule was if there's any way to avoid it, you don't wake the other person up. You let somebody sleep. Like I said, you want to have the boat set up so that you can actually operate the sailing systems if you need to. If I had to reef, I had to get up. It took 2 of us to do it, and so we were always both up if we had to put in a reef. But one of the things that we did was after dinner at 7 o'clock, if we were sailing with 1 reef in, I would put in a 2nd reef. If we were sailing with 2 reefs in, I would put in a 3rd. It would slow us down by a knot and a half, something like that. However, it would allow both of us to sleep. So we thought it was worthwhile trading. Anyway, 5 to 8, a 3-hour watch. My wife would take over from 5 to 8. Another a 4-hour watch from 8 to 12, which was my watch, and then 12 to 4, her watch, 4 to 7, my watch. So the point was to get that 5 hours. It doesn't work out to 5 hours of actual sleep because you got to wash the dishes, make coffee, and eating dinner. All of that takes a little time out of it. We got a good solid 4 hours of sleep, and I think that was one of the keys to being longevity. I mean, it's hard going sometimes. Even with that watch schedule, we were completely trashed. We sailed from Panama to Kingston, Jamaica, and we waited and waited and waited in Panama until we had a weather forecast that the trade winds in the winter in the Caribbean periodically drop to the south. So you get winds that are either completely east or very, very slightly southeast. So we waited and waited and waited until that was forecast. And then we sailed out a countercurrent along the coast of Panama until we got to about to Cartagena, Colombia. And then we turned north, and we were expecting that wind on the mean. About 8 hours after we turned north, it walked around to the northeast again and blew about 25 to 30 knots for the next 8 days. So when we got to Kingston, we were completely trashed. However, we did manage to make it, and sometimes it just takes biting the whip. At one point, I guess about 6 days into that trip, My wife came up and she said, is there just some way we can just make it stop for a while? And I said, yes, there is. We can go to the Caymans. However, that's going to leave us with 300 miles to beat back to Jamaica. Even just heaving to and waiting for, get a good sleep would have caused us to drift back the way we came at about 2 knots. So in the end we said, okay, we're just going to bite our lip and we're going to tough it out. We tried motoring, we couldn't because the prop wouldn't stay in the water. So we sailed all the way, but it tells you how tough fiberglass cruising boats are. When we got there, we were completely trashed. The boat was fine. Years later, when we sold the boat, we found out that it had been a hard ride. We were, the Caribbean is prone to these kind of squarish sort of shaped waves because it's fairly shallow and a lot of wind over current. And so we were, we would come to a complete stop crashing into a wave and it would shake and shudder and then we'd get moving again 3 or 4 knots and bang, and it just sounded like you were inside of a cement truck when you came off the wave. And when Allison Maison did a survey when we sold the boat, we had yellow stripes just above the waterline down both sides of the boat that hadn't been there when we bought the boat. And I couldn't figure out what, they wouldn't scrub off, they wouldn't rub out, they were just there. And Allison looked at them and then climbed inside the boat, and there was these horizontal stringers inside the boat, which was a half-round tube of fiberglass that was, to reinforce at the waterline. Those yellow stripes were microfractures from the gel coat flexing and flexing and flexing and flexing. When we got to Kingston, I found that my holding tank was full. You have a little vent through the side of the hull, points down. It's about that big. 5/8 hose that goes into your holding tank. You run the bow through enough waves, you can fill the holding tank. It was a Pearson 36. Essentially the same hull shape as something like a Valiant 40. A skeg hung rudder and a fairly deep center keel, 7,000 pounds of lead, 18,000 pound boat. So it was a heavy 36 footer, but not as heavy as some of the real full displacement, full keel old timers. I think the West Sail 32 weighs 21,000 pounds with about 5 feet left waterline. They're not fast. So I'm wandering about a little bit. Charlie asked about water. You can learn to get by on very little water. We took a freshwater shower every 2 to 3 days. We drank all the water that we wanted to drink. But when we took a freshwater shower, we had a solar shower. We actually had plum showers, and we had a standalone shower down below. We also had a shower in the head, or in the cockpit, because in the tropics you don't want to shower down below on any boat. It's just too hot, and it gets wet down there, which more wet is not what you're looking for. But we always used a sun shower, not because we were getting the water heated by the sun. If we'd been running the engine, we'd have hot water, but I would run the hot water into the sun shower. 2 gallons, 2 people. You get 1 gallon to take a shower. You have to have access to salt water. We wash dishes always in salt water at sea. You never do that in port or in Anchorage because people are pooping in the water. but at sea, we would, if we're filling flush, we would rinse them with fresh water. Otherwise, just towel them off. But you need a foot pump or something to access seawater for things where it just needs to be wet, and it doesn't matter if it's salty. Our boat carried 150 gallons of water, and we could get by easily for a month on 50. Mostly, it's discipline. You drink all the water you want to, but otherwise, you don't use it for much of anything.
Like rainwater?
What's that? We did not. That's something that some people do. It's complicated, and especially complicated at sea, because usually when there's sufficient rain, you're in a squall and you've got salt water leaping about too. So import in a tropical anchorage, if you have to, what you do is set up a lot of tarps with a funnel at the bottom that runs into your tanks. So much shush in the air, you know, when you're in a populated place, I just didn't trust it. And we didn't need to. With 150 gallons of water, it was never an issue. We did eventually acquire a water maker, and that was simply because there were places like, we spent 3 months in El Salvador, and the water there was so brackish that you didn't want to fill your tanks. And there was so much volcanic grit in the stuff coming out of the sky, you didn't want to fill your tanks with that either.
When you were in port, where did you get your water? Like if you were in Mexico, you presumably weren't drinking it out of a hose.
We actually were most of the time.
Oh, really?
If we were in questionable places, what we would do is add chlorine.
Oh.
Quarter of a cup of chlorine in 50 gallons of water. You wait about 4 hours, and that meets the EPA standard. The residual chlorine is unpleasant, but not. We had a carbon filter for our drinking water, so it's not terrible. You can drink it even without filtering it. But we also found that most places have perfectly drinkable water. Even marinas that say this is not drinkable water, I learned to ask them a question. Is this the water you drink, or is this just washed down water? And generally the answer was, we were shopping for a house in Shelter Bay up in La Conner, Washington. Their marina has a sign that says, this is not drinkable water. They do that because you've got piping running down the dock and all that. And the risk of contamination is such no one wants to take the chance. Most of the time the marinas are just connected to the domestic water supply. And most places in Mexico that are towns big enough to have a marina have a pretty safe water supply. In fact, in the Baja Peninsula, extremely safe because there isn't any surface water, so they make it.
Oh.
If it's been pressed through a filter that will take out salt, it takes out the germs too. So almost every town, like La Paz, was a tiny little town in Mexico until desalination plants were invented. And now they use reverse osmosis, which will filter not only salt but everything else out of the water.
Some of the small towns in Baja, really good water coming out. So it limited how big they get.
Yeah.
Shooting,
Yeah.
You know, 10s, 20, 30, 40 feet.
Yeah, there's actually no permanent, they do get rain runoff from the mountains, but there is no permanent surface water anywhere on Baja.
They would collect it.
Yeah, collect it when it comes down. You know, when it rains up there, we get some water for a while and then it stops.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, so, bounding about here, but speaking of using salt water, sanitation, which is something else Charlie asked about. In this country, you've got to use a holding tank. You've got to find a place to pump it out. Before you take off around the world, you need to make sure that if you have a way to empty your holding tank without pumping it out at the dock. From the time we left San Diego until we returned to San Diego, we saw one working pump out station. So even in countries, most of the Caribbean and most of Mexico, it's illegal to discharge over the side. However, there are no other alternatives. So you know they're not very serious about it. Generally speaking, you use common sense. You fill your holding tank while you're sitting at anchor when there's people snorkeling around you, because you don't want to run into a degrading piece of TP floating in front of your mast any more than they do. So you use common sense when you're offshore. You empty your holding tank. And one other, I guess this is kind of a TMI thing, but just if you ever do own a boat, most cruisers do not put TP down the toilet. We went 5 years without a single plug until took one of our sailing friends who I thought knew better. I didn't tell him. You know, put your TP in. We put it in a separate container, save it. You know, it sounds gross, but that's always what plugs up the toilet. Marine toilets work fine as long as you don't try to force a bunch of paper. What happens is the hoses get thinner and thinner. Salts from urine, way too much information, accumulate in the hoses, and things that start as an 1.5-inch hose, I had to clean them out one time in a place where I couldn't buy new hoses. and they were about a half an inch functional diameter. That's not it. You don't want to hear how that job goes, so I won't say that. Pirates, carjackers. Pirates exist. I would not sail off the coast of Somalia for any money, for any reason. When we were sailing from Jamaica out to the Eastern Caribbean, we stayed about 15 miles off of Haiti. The rest of the way off Dominican Republic, we sailed 2 to 5 miles offshore. However, you do hear about people being attacked by pirates all the time. You don't hear about people not being attacked by pirates. It's very much like you hear about people who get in a wreck on the way to work. But no one does a half-hour news segment on all the people who got to work today who didn't get in the wreck. So, I think it's overblown. It's something to pay attention to, but not to worry too much about. A related and very contentious issue among sailors is firearms. Some sailors would not sail without them, others wouldn't have them. I'm in the won't have them camp. Will not. And I'll tell you my reasons. One, everybody I know that carries them hides them from customs and immigration. If you get caught, you may lose your boat. It's just stupid. The other thing comes from my law enforcement training, which says if you have a good guy with a gun and a bad guy without one, usually the bad guy wins. Somebody gets shot and it's usually the good guy. The reason it happens is like this. I really am thinking, if I reached a point where I have to kill this person, meanwhile this person is thinking, have I reached a point where I can kill this one? It's not a fair fight. And
They get there first.
even police officers who are extremely well trained, 30% of police officer shootings are with their own gun. So, for me, it was a no-brainer.
Also, if the bad guy knows that you have a gun.
What's that?
If the bad guy knows that you have a gun,
Well,
they have no choice but to use theirs.
yeah. It's, you can argue that it's a deterrent. Certainly, if somebody were forcing their way aboard my boat, I would instantly rethink my decision, but it wouldn't do me any good. But I think, in the long run, I would still make that decision every time. And in part, it's just the whole customs. Some places, you can't have a gun. And if you show up with a gun, either they're going to seize it and hold it until you leave, or if you don't tell them you have it, and they find it, they may lock you up. They may take your boat. At very least, it's going to be extremely unpleasant for quite some time. Harbor masters. Charlie asked about. I'm lumping customs, immigration, harbor masters, everything into all one lump. Rule one to me is treat people with respect and respect the fact that you're in their country. They get to make their own rules and you get to follow. Sometimes you'll find places where it seems like the rules are really weird. In Mexico, every time you move from one harbor to the next harbor, you have to check in with the port captain, check out with the port captain, check in with the next port captain. I thought that was really screwy, and then I talked to Canadians. They do that in this country. When Canadians have a cruising permit to cruise in the United States, every time they change ports, they have to go to the captain's port, submit a form, tell them where they're going, and check in the next place when they get there. So it's just like that. And the sooner you get used to it being like that, the less irritating it is. I watched a Frenchman come into Beckway, which is in St. Vincent and Grenadines, and used to the EU. So he came in and berated this young lady at the counter for all the paperwork he had to do. And she smiled at him and gave him the form, and he said, you'll have to fill out this form, and we'll check you in. And he went and filled out the form, and then he came right up to the desk, and he handed it to her, and she said, the back of the line's up there. So I'd say it probably took 4 hours for him to accomplish what took me 15 minutes.
Are there fees that you pay for
Yes.
like that, and do they vary from? Like
They
that?
vary a lot. They're completely trivial in most cases.
Oh, okay.
They're very small amounts of money. In some cases, this is And I don't know how to even address corruption completely. We found in the Dominican Republic, unfortunately we knew this ahead of time, customs and immigration people are not paid. So there's what they call propina, which is a tip, the Spanish word for a tip. The propina was about $5 a head. They sent a team of like 8 people to check us in. We were ready for that. Make sure you have correct change. They're not going to have any. But it turns out that much of the Spanish colonial empire was built on corruption, in the sense that, I mean, it was planned that way. When you became a customs officer, you didn't get a salary, you just got whatever you could skim off the top.
That's the way it was in the colonial times here.
What's it?
That's the way it was here.
Right, but it was not that way in England, and that's where our laws, historically our laws come from, is the English common law and English maritime law, and so we don't have that culture of corruption. It's hard to get used to if you're not from those places.
Maybe different culture of corruption.
Yeah. Speaking of respect, one of the things that I learned early on, in Latin America, it's considered fairly rude to walk into a government office in shorts. I had my customs uniform, which was a button-up shirt, a pair of khakis. They were a little tattered and worn and usually wet from a dinghy ride into the customs office. But doing my best, because they're standing there in an office that's about 120 degrees with a little tiny fan blowing on them, and they're wearing a starched white shirt and black slacks, and they take offense. It's actually illegal in Panama to do business with the government in shorts. And these are the good things to know, because the last thing you want is to start an adversarial relationship with someone who's in a position of complete power. If they are corrupt, if they're shaking you down, you can assume that they've done it many times, that their government lets them get away with it, and that you're on the short end of this transaction. I left something out of provisioning that we learned also very early on. We heard a lot of things about what was available, what wasn't available in various places, and people talking about carrying enough food for 6 months or a year on your boat. It turns out that every place you're going, there are people. And every place there's people, there's food. You got to be a little flexible about what you're cooking. In particular, the butcher counter in any place in the United States, you're going to go, I don't know, pig or cow, what do you think? Never mind what cut. There's not going to be any cut you ever heard of anyway. So once you get that worked out, and just learn to cook the things that are available, you don't have to provision for months and months. You're going to be able to resupply whenever you need to. You need a provision for, I always said that we had to carry at least enough food for 3 times as long as I expected to be at sea. So, leaving for Jamaica, I thought it would only be about 6 days. So we had 18 days of food. It took us 8 days, but and there's deep spares. There's things like pasta in vacuum sealed bags and things like that you can carry. You don't expect to use. So provisioning is more learning to be flexible than anything else.
You read about people who underestimated how long it was going to take them.
Mm-hmm.
And years and years when I was a teenager, read about 2 guys who were leaving Hawaii, so they bought just enough food to get into Mexico. They got the calm, and they were eating tuna. They found a bag of flour in the village and were making tortillas with the tuna oil. The writer said he did not want to see another can of tuna the rest of the day. But they got there.
Yeah. So let's see. I think calms. Charlie asked about what do you storms and calms. Storms I kind of talked about already. I try to be at home under the bed when they happen. So far, I've been pretty successful. The Coast Guard sent me out in front of some pretty nasty ones. However, at that point I was in pretty top-notch equipment. It wasn't, no, it was terrifying, but it wasn't as dangerous as it seemed. But I would not voluntarily be in a storm at sea. And with the 10-day weather windows, the weather models are not perfect. You know, they may tell you you're going to get 20 knots of wind and you get 40. You're not going to get a hurricane even Otis was forecast 3 days out. And that was the fastest building storm in the history of storms. So they didn't know it was going to be a Cat 5, but 3 days out they already knew that Acapulco was in the path. And of course it's hurricane season, which meant I would never have been anywhere near there. I would have been either in Panama or safely in the United States, or maybe Ensenada or something, but never anywhere in between during hurricane season. So I think you need to prepare for, we carried what's called a series drogue, which is a bunch of little cones that are attached to a long line. Because they're instead of having, it's like having 200 little tiny parachutes behind. They drag through the water much more evenly. One parachute either collapses or surges with each wave, and it winds up making the ride rougher rather than better. They're also almost 100% non-retrievable. Unless you wait until the weather that made you put it out is completely gone, you're never going to be able to get it back. They're just too hard to haul in. The series drogue you can haul in on a sailboat winch. So we carried one of those. Essentially, you stream it over the stern, you put all the boards in the companionway, you close the companionway hatch, you go down below and probably read a book, whatever it is you do. but we never used it. And I'm very glad we never used it. You can avoid storms. You cannot avoid calms. There are going to be times when the wind just doesn't blow. And there's two schools of thought on that. I'm in the school of thought that if I've got the diesel, I'll burn it. There are people who don't even have an engine. If you don't have an engine, wait. That's really all you can do. The one thing that I learned one time we didn't have an engine, when our engine expired just as we were leaving Cabo and we were headed to La Paz, which was intended to be a 2-day trip with an overnight and an anchorage somewhere. It took us 5 days sailing against the prevailing current and against the prevailing wind. And every night the wind would drop to near zero. But what we found was that we could actually make 5 to 10 miles on an overnight watch, you know, with the meter just ticking up to half a knot here, 2/10 of a knot, always pointed in the right direction. The key was just point in the right direction and keep trying, and that's all you can do. That applies to if you're crossing an ocean and you don't have enough fuel. I would say that a good compromise position for that, if you're going to cross an ocean, it's probably may involve crossing the equator. You want to take enough fuel, the motor, about 400 miles. Because there's a little band right around the equator where the wind almost never blows. You may sit there for a very long time waiting to drift across to where the wind starts on the other side. So that's a good compromise point of view. A 400-mile range, any more than that, a sailboat doesn't need it to cross an ocean because you can't possibly carry enough to motor across. Yeah.
You have a autopilot or something?
Oh yeah. That I didn't cover a lot of the boat upgrades, but we started out with an autopilot that was not very reliable and a wind vane. Never really got to be friends with the wind vane. Drug it around. It was there as a backup. When we got to as soon as we got to Mexico, we got a good autopilot that was reliable and lasted 5 years with no repairs. A good below-deck autopilot is a very worthwhile investment for long-range cruising because it goes from even like the 3, 4, 5 watch schedule that I was talking about would be unsuited to an autopilot, to hand steering. about 2 or 3 hours on the helm, when you can't let go of the helm, you're done. So you have to be able, now you can get by with just a windmill, but technology being what it is now, put some solar panels up there. Chuck was talking about spending the whole summer without ever having to run an engine. Keep the fridge going and keep the systems, keep the lights on the boat, just by having some solar panels. So the technology is there. I became very attached to our electronic autopilot. Yeah, hand steering, pretty much out of the question. And to my mind, the various makeshift boats around the tiller and things like that are just not reliable enough. Way too many times they're unable to steer, and you wind up having to do so. So I've jumped around a little bit, but I think I've got to my last page. The last thing I wanted to talk about was safety. I'm not going to tell you what rules you ought to have. Everybody has their own safety tolerance. The thing that's really important if you're sailing with someone else is that you decide up front what the rules are, and then you respect them. I can't tell you how poorly I've slept on Coast Guard ships sometimes where it was funny because the juniorist watchstanders, I knew I could count on. I knew that if anything came up where they were the slightest bit unsure of themselves, they called. When the XO was on watch, I was worried. Because the XO was going to be standing there going, you know, the instructions say I'm supposed to call the captain, but he's sound asleep and I can handle this. So, but distill that down to 2 people on a boat. If you have a rule, we had a rule that says you don't leave the cockpit at night without the other person on deck. And we wore PFD at night, we had a tether on at night. But if you have to go forward, you wake up the other person. We had things set up. We could furl both the staysail and the jib from the cockpit. If we had to reef, it took 2 people anyway. So there weren't a lot of things that would require you to go forward. But the point is that you make those rules and then you make sure that the other person knows that you're going to follow them. Because it really interferes with your sleep. So there are all kinds of rules from, I've known people who, they never wear a life jacket, they go, never put on a tether, go wandering up across the deck in the middle of the night. Sometimes I'm never seen again. Sad truth, a large number of men who go missing from sailboats are found with their fly open.
Yeah. Also, a lot of drowned people are found with the life jackets, but not. But Coast Guard had a report a few years ago on how many people were drowned with life jackets, how many people were drowned with life jackets properly put on, and then a very small number of people who drowned with life jackets.
Mm-hmm.
Run safety lines?
Yeah. Yeah, we ran jack lines down both sides of the boat. Clear so that you can snap a line on it and you can walk the length of the boat with a tether without it. A tether is a little bit annoying. However, it pretty much guarantees that you stay with the boat. And that's really rule 1. Stay on the boat under all circumstances. Common saying among sailors is the only time you get off the boat at sea is to get in your life raft. And you only do that when you need to step up to do so. Chuck?
I have 3 different PFDs. I have an offshore inflatable, which has a built-in harness. And since the boat's been up north, I've never had a need for it. The other one is the stuff that West Marine and everybody else sells. They are unbelievably comfortable, so much so that you forget you have them on.
Mm-hmm.
So there's really no reason not to wear them.
Yeah.
And the third one is kind of an old-fashioned jacket type, which I keep because when I used to sail off the coast at night, no matter what month of the year it is, it's cold.
Mm-hmm.
And the life jacket actually is a warming garment. I was much warmer with it on, no matter how big my foul weather gear was. than I was if I left it off.
Yeah.
So they
Yeah,
are,
And
they
we
help.
went sailing before, current regulations, racing regulations require that an offshore jacket, not only does it have a harness for your tether, but it has to have a crotch strap, and, you know, they're kind of uncomfortable.
Yeah, they are.
They hadn't even invented them when we set off to go sailing, and we never used them. But we constantly used the inflatable with a harness. The harness is just two little rings right here that your tether snaps into. I know that the other ones are a bit lighter than the offshore ones. I've got a couple of those on my current boat. Either way, they're not terribly encumbering. Even in the tropics, they're not terribly hot. As Chuck says, you know, actually the float coat is an ideal thing. A float coat is essentially a neoprene wetsuit that's sized like a jacket, so you can just slip it on. It's a fabulous thing to wear in the wintertime, but not suitable for tropics. I like sailing in places where I don't have to wear shoes, so never been a fan of the jacket.
When I was on board a training ship, my life jacket lived on the side of the bunk opposite of the wall, underneath the mattress.
Mhm.
That's where it lived. Because when you can feel the life jacket on your hip, you know you're not falling out of your bunk. But also, I knew where it was all the time.
Other questions?
You're going to go sailing again. What do you find attractive? What draws you back to the sea?
Well, it's hard to say. I like the adventure. I mean, I enjoy, I've spent a little bit of time up in the Bay Islands, for example, which is, we sailed past the San Juans into Canada, and there's this giant archipelago of nice little islands, nicely sheltered anchorages, just a wonderful place to explore. I've always enjoyed that. I really enjoy nights at sea, which I'm not going to see much of in the Salish, obviously, but just
Right, the clear sky,
Waking
the,
up.
the millions of stars.
yeah, or just a moment that is like a snapshot that's never going to leave. Went down below to pour a cup of coffee from the thermos. I walk back up out of the companionway. I stick my head up so I'm at just a companionway level. And I look, and it seems frozen in time, obviously. You can't just hang in the air. There was the dolphin about 3 feet above the rail and about probably 4 feet away from the boat. He looked me in the eye and swore he winked at me. And just that moment was just frozen there. And then splash. But he's running around. By the way, dolphins like red light better than green light.
Huh.
So at night, when they're playing in the bow wake, it's always on the port side. Don't know why.
When I was on the training ship, after 2 weeks, some people went crazy. Got really strange.
Yes, there's a saying that a boat at sea loses a foot a week.
Okay.
So, you know, if you're on a 2-month passage, that boat gets real small. My wife tells people when they ask her what it was like, it's like living in a walk-in closet. Move your stove, your refrigerator into your walk-in closet, and you know, when you have a little tiff with your sailing partner, you can go in the head and slam the door, but then you're in the head. The only other thing you could do is get in the dinghy and be towed around behind the boat. So it tests relationships. It tests. I think, you know, some things like test your willpower, like talking about that transit from Panama to Jamaica. It was just a matter of, you know, we're going to get to Jamaica. If we stop trying, then we'll just have to work harder at it later. So you get those kinds of tests. Many people hallucinate after, especially after deprived of sleep for a while. So Josh Slocum, dancing girls on the deck. You know. I think he made a lot of that stuff up, but it's based on real events.
Wildlife at sea.
Did you ever have any close encounters with life ships?
Oh yeah,
Especially at night?
I left that out of if preparing a boat to go cruising today. You absolutely have to have AIS. AIS is a little device. It's a VHF radio connected to a GPS, and you program in the identity of your boat. A lot of people want one that receives so they can see other traffic. I wanted one that sends. We had so many occasions where you could not raise a ship on the radio. You want to know whether they've seen you or not. They're doing 25 knots and you're doing 4. So getting out of the way is hard. You have to plan way ahead to get out of the way if they don't see you. If you call them by name and they can see a little dot on their screen, my 36-footer is the same size as the super tank. Which means that they know I'm there, and it was night and day. We had the experience of incredibly good luck leaving the Dominican Republic, crossing the Mono Passage, which is pretty famous for being nasty. We made Puerto Rico on one tack, with the exception of having to tack away from a freighter because we called them and called them and called them and called them and called them. Never got them on the radio and finally just had to tack away. So having AIS, that was one year my wife and I decided we weren't going to buy Christmas gifts for each other. We were each going to buy something for the boat that made us more comfortable. I bought a 45-pound Rockna anchor, and she bought an AIS.
How many navigation systems do you have on board? Do you have your primary backup, your tertiary?
I had 3 GPS. I had a full-blown chart plotter, which was the primary. I had a secondary, which was a little Garmin, like a 4-inch screen. I did have charts of the world for that. And then the third one was just a GPS. And I didn't mention charts. You know, if you read cruising books, they'll tell you you have to have a copy of every page of chart there is, which will sink your boat. I settled for backup charts. You can get these pre-printed books. They're printed at half scale, and it's a book about that thick that will cover something like the Pacific coast from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego. The charts are not terribly detailed. You don't have good harbor charts, but they'll get you somewhere where you can get help. So I carried those combined with backup, and for a while I actually had a sextant and tight reduction tables, and then when we decided we weren't actually going to cross any oceans, I sold them to somebody who was.
You also have radar?
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, that is for radar.
Oh, no, it is.
You get a lot of lights in longitude location.
Yeah.
The plotted.
Yeah, the AIS, essentially everybody has a VHF radio besides the one that they're talking on, a separate one that's part of the AIS. It has a built-in GPS, so it's actually, for me, that was a 4th GPS. It's transmitting your latitude and longitude, course and speed, and particulars of the vessel. So even without radar, if you have a modern chart plotter, all of those ships that are out there are on your screen.
Right, it has to, there's some interface to see where they are.
Right. It's just
Either
receiving.
chart plotter or radar.
It's receiving their transmission.
Yeah.
So the chart plotter is receiving from the AIS. You know, there's this ship out here. It was just night and day with approaching Panama without the AIS. Early days, we were approaching from the Pacific side, and one morning I just took a screenshot of the radar because it was like measles. It was all ships at anchor, waiting to transit the canal. And when we came back through the canal, I found out what the 256 was the limit. For digital obvious reasons. My AIS would only plot 256 contacts. There were that many ships sitting outside the mouth of the canal. And it's pretty constant at that rate. It wasn't like there was a slowdown or anything. It's just, that's how many ships there are going back and forth through the canal constantly.
Some people may not be aware that there's another layer on top of all that. It's probably got a big fancy name, but I just refer to it as Seattle traffic.
Oh yeah.
And it's channel 5 on your radio, and you call them and they immediately know who you are and where you are. And if you do it at night and you get in trouble, they will call you ahead of time and say, sailing vessel Blue Moon, there's a freighter in your path. Go left or right, but go somewhere. And it's a lifesaver for folks. And a small story, we were crossing the mouth of the bay under the Golden Gate Bridge, and it was nighttime and foggy, and that's a big boat traffic area. And without SF traffic, we could not have crossed the mouth without getting hit.
Yeah.
So it's a good system.
Oh, yeah, yeah. When I have a similar story when sailing around in the San Juan Islands, before there was AIS even. And at that time you had to tell them where you were. They didn't have the ability to actually determine where you were from the radio. But in a friend's borrowed sailboat and crossing right at the mouth of Harrow Straits, coming out of the San Juan Islands and headed back to Port Townsend. And that's the entrance to Harrow Straits where only the freighters are headed up there. And I called traffic and they said, hold where you are for about 15 minutes. There's a freighter passing in front of you and he'll call you when he's done. So we're sitting there in pea soup fog, we can see from about here to that wall. And he passed about a quarter of a mile away. The boat actually had radar, so we saw it. But wouldn't have identified what he was or where he was going without Seattle traffic. Passed a quarter of a mile away, and we heard at one point the flop, flop, flop of the propeller being halfway out of the water. Never saw a thing. So, yeah, in many major ports, practically every major port in the world these days, their systems exist, and they speak English. It's like air traffic control, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, they speak their local language and English.
You were mentioning about hand steering. I took my Grand Bank from Olympia to Victoria back, so we had several 8 to 12 hour runs. The first day, the autopilot decided it only liked making left turns. So I hand steered, and that was unbelievably exhausting.
Yeah.
Especially the 12-hour run down from, we were trying to get ahead of the storm, so we left Victoria, and we did 12, 14 hours down to Olympia. That was just, didn't want to do anything.
It's mind-numbing. You cannot take your focus away, in sailboats especially. In most sailboats, you let go of the helm, you round it up into the wind instantly. So, you can't even step away from the helm. You can lock it sometimes or whatever, but if you don't have some sort of self-steering, you probably need more like 6 people than 2. I'm done.
Thank you.
I'm glad the rain let up, or I would be hoarse, but lost my voice completely by now. Bill?
Yeah, so, Mitch asked me to say